I want to talk today about the great technicians of prose. Um, and what I mean by that, I think, is not necessarily the best sentence makers. Um, I think the two best sentence makers aren't in my four great technicians. Um, but they have a kind of what's often called a kind of Mandarin style, a high style, or sometimes called an aristocratic style, where there's a sort of distance from the prose. And that's not the case in every one of my four, but in three of them. But when I read these four writers, I feel more than any other writer that they their placement, their construction of sentences is somehow sort of almost perfect, as though they just have a greater level of technique. Um, and sometimes I think that's maybe a disadvantage, that technique can have some impact on sometimes the messiness of art or the chance or luck of art. Um, but not that these aren't great artists, one of them especially. Um, so almost everything I'm going to say is going to contradict itself, except that once again, I feel when I'm reading these, there is a sort of an effortless originality that somehow makes complete sense, as though, of course, that is how writing should be. It doesn't include my favourite writers, certainly my favourite sentence maker, who I think is the greatest sentence maker, which is James Salter. But there's something else, and I don't exactly know what it is. So if we have a look at this, I think So I'm going to start. If I go from the earliest, it would be Joyce. This is the Dubliners, his collection of short stories. But I think it starts, or it's most evident in Ulysses. And there is something about Joyce which makes him the kind of quintessential technician. And obviously, when we get to Finnegan's Wake, he's a technician of a new language, and it allows, I think, Finnegan's Wake, which is almost unreadable, to be readable. If anyone else had done it, it would have been pure gobbledygook, but it's not, because there is this gift. So yes, I mean the first sentence of Ulysses, which I haven't got here because I can't find my copy, um, is a real example of writing that feels as though it understands itself and knows what it wants to do, and has no it has complete confidence in itself. My second writer is Nabokov. Now, what's obviously extraordinary about Nabokov is that he's actually not even writing in his first language. His first language was Russian, and he's writing in you could argue American English rather than English. And maybe it is that gives his prose such precision and that kind of detached quality. I don't know. I mean, it would seem the case, although of course native writers have that. But Nabokov seems to be someone almost without error in his prose, as though he knows exactly what he wants to do and is incapable of screwing it up, of making a kind of formal mistake. And he's obviously formal, especially in Pale Fire. It's formally incredibly interesting. You know, it's the novel is notes about a poem. But once again, when I'm reading this, I don't feel that this writer has any struggle at all. I mean, and I, of course, I'm sure these writers pore over their work and rewrite and rewrite and rewrite. But of course, but that's part of it. That's the idea that you know when your rewrites have done the work they have done. Um, Now, of course, I would struggle to argue what is different about these to let's say, James Salter, who, as I said, the most magnificent sentence maker, or Hemingway, who's the most fantastic sentence maker, and almost has this. But I in a sense, I feel Hemingway behind the right. I feel the struggle. I feel the personality. In a sense, I don't feel these personalities behind this writing. It's that their technique is so perfect that they disappear. The third one is a rather unusual choice, I think, given who I'm talking about, but it's J.D. Salinger. And here's Raise High the Roof Beams, Carpenters and Seymour. I think this is first edition. And if so, I think I got it at snip at £10. But I do think that in his later short stories that Salinger did show this extraordinary to say it's perfectionism is the wrong word again, because once again I'm struggling to say what I want to say. But there is a naturalness to his prose which I almost don't think I found in anybody else. And it'd be very interesting to read his writing when his estate apparently are going to publish it. I didn't realise that till a few days ago until someone told me. But there is a great naturalness in Salinger, which very, very few writers can produce, and effortlessness and all of that. And at the same time, it doesn't read like. I mean, I think what's interesting about this, of course, is that it was only through modernism did prose become something that one could write almost without story behind it. Virginia Woolf could have been here in this roundup, but actually I think she's a slightly more erratic writer, and she vibrates a bit more behind her prose, and I don't feel that with Joyce or Nabokov. And I actually don't feel it with Salinger, although I think he's a much more human writer from those other two. And my final one is David Foster Wallace. This is The Pale King. This is an unfinished novel that may have been one of the reasons that drove him to suicide. I don't know. A very sad end to an extraordinarily gifted man. And for anyone who can't quite get on with David Foster Wallace's novels, his essays are magnificent and some of the most deeply human and empathetic works by a fiction writer. What's extraordinary about The Pale King, given that it's written about the American Inland Revenue Service, is just how extraordinary the writing is. And it seems to me that for what is it? When I read Foster Wallace, it's almost as though he has more gifts than anybody else when he writes. Of all the other people I've just spoken to, he is the most gifted, except that giftedness, the creation of that, taking that technique and making it the best it can be. I think in his fiction, he gets lost. The emotion and empathy in David Foster Wallace is lost behind the crystalline perfection, not beauty, but crystalline perfection of that is the only order these words could have gone in. There's no ambiguity to it, as though he could have chosen otherwise. And I'm sure he did, because there's been lots of reworking. So I don't know whether this is in any way interesting. It certainly, I'm sure, is not in any way clear. But I do think I'm speaking to one interesting part of fiction writing, which is that technique and perfection don't necessarily make for the books we love, although I'm sure people do love these books, and maybe Salinger most of all, but we can admire them. And sometimes I think it is perfectly acceptable for a great piece of literature to be part of at the top of the canon, as it were, simply through our admiration. And maybe sometimes we do get slightly, we move away from that because we can often love books because we love the characters. We often love books because the sort of beauty or poetic sense of it, or the vision, or whatever, or the story. Whereas these writers, I think, are absolutely about the writing. And apart from Salinger, I think they do. I think they make it hard for us to love them. But it is no mean feat for us to admire them as much as we do. And I think that may be actually the case with Alan Hollinghurst, the English writer, is that he's a brilliant, brilliant writer, but sometimes I think just keeps us, his prose style keeps us slightly at a distance. Anyway, that's it. I'm not sure it was very clear, but I hope it was thought-provoking in some way. Many thanks. Bye-bye.